They pulled a black boy off the plane for doing nothing. The pilot laughed, thinking he was in control, but he did not know the boy's father was the FAA administrator. And within days, the airline would lose $5 billion in funding. This is where power meets prejudice and learns a lesson in justice. The sun rose softly over Atlanta Airport as the sound of rolling suitcases echoed across the busy terminal. A young black boy named Malik stood near Gate 32, holding his backpack tightly. His mother had told him to wait there while she grabbed something to eat. He was only 13, and this was his first time flying alone to visit his grandparents in Washington. He was excited but also nervous. The loudspeaker kept calling flights, and people rushed by dressed in suits and uniforms. Malik watched the airplanes through the big glass window, his eyes full of wonder. He loved planes since he was little. His dream was to become a pilot one day, just like the ones walking past him with shiny wings on their shirts. But not everyone around him saw that dream in his eyes. A white pilot with silver hair, named Captain Ronald, noticed Malik standing alone. He frowned and muttered to himself, thinking the boy looked out of place. Captain Ronald had worked for 25 years, but he had a reputation for arrogance and bias. He walked over to the gate agent, a young woman named Tina, and whispered loud enough for others to hear, "There's a boy loitering by the gate." He said suspiciously, "I don't think he belongs here. He might be sneaking around." The agent looked confused. "Sir, he is just a kid, probably waiting for someone." Ronald shook his head. "Call airport security. I have seen this before," he said, his voice sharp and full of judgment. Within minutes, 2 security officers approached Malik. Their sudden presence made him freeze. One of them asked, "Where are your parents, son?" Malik stuttered, "My mom went to get food. She told me to wait here. Please, I am not doing anything wrong." But the officers ignored his trembling voice. One of them grabbed his arm and began asking more questions. "What's in your bag? What are you doing here?" Malik's heart raced. He felt scared, embarrassed, and confused. People started staring. Phones came out recording. The pilot crossed his arms, watching with cold authority. When his mother returned, she saw her son surrounded by security, her food bag dropping from her hand. She ran shouting, "That's my son. What are you doing?" The officers looked uncertain, but the pilot insisted, "Check their tickets. They're probably lying." The gate agent's face turned pale. This was going too far. Tina quickly checked her system and found Malik's name listed as a confirmed passenger with a valid guardian verification. She turned to the pilot and said, "Sir, he is cleared to travel. He has every right to be here." Ronald scoffed. "Maybe the system made a mistake. I have seen plenty of fraud before." The crowd started murmuring, some filming, others shaking their heads. A man in a business suit nearby stepped forward, his expression unreadable. He spoke calmly, but his voice carried power. "What seems to be the problem here?" The pilot turned and replied, "This boy was hanging around the gate, acting suspicious. I was just ensuring safety." The man raised an eyebrow and said slowly, "I see. And who gave you the authority to harass a minor without reason?" Everyone turned to look at him, unaware that this was not just any man, but someone who would change everything. The entire terminal went silent as the man stepped closer. His calm but commanding tone cut through the noise around them. The pilot stiffened, unsure why the stranger's presence suddenly made him uneasy. The man placed a hand on Malik's shoulder, gently asking, "Son, are you okay?" Malik looked up, eyes wet with tears. "Dad," they thought, "I did something wrong. I was just waiting here like Mom said." The crowd gasped, "Dad?" The word echoed through the air. The pilot blinked in surprise, then narrowed his eyes. "You're his father? Then maybe you should teach your kid not to linger near secured areas," he said arrogantly. The man took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing slightly before he spoke. "I would suggest you lower your tone." Captain Ronald frowned. "How do you know my name?" The man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a sleek black ID wallet, flipping it open. The shiny golden badge reflected under the airport lights. Federal Aviation Administration, Senior Administrator James Turner. A wave of shock rippled through the crowd. The pilot's confident smirk vanished instantly. His throat went dry. His boss's boss stood right in front of him. Gasps filled the terminal. Phones recorded the scene from every direction. Security officers quickly released Malik, stepping back in embarrassment. The gate agent's jaw dropped. "Sir, I didn't know," she stammered. James Turner's voice turned icy. "I was flying home quietly on the next flight when I saw my son being interrogated by uniformed officers based on nothing but your assumption. You embarrassed a child and endangered his safety because of your prejudice." Ronald stuttered, "I was just following safety protocol. Sir, it's a busy airport." and I thought he looked suspicious. I was ensuring security. James stepped forward, his tone controlled, but full of authority. A child holding a boarding pass waiting for his mother does not qualify as a security threat. You didn't check facts. You made a decision based on what? Skin color? The crowd murmured in agreement. Several passengers nodded, one saying out loud, "That's messed up," another adding, "Yeah, this happens too." Often James looked around at the officers and the pilot, saying loud enough for everyone to hear, "Let this be a lesson in what real leadership looks like. You protect people, you don't humiliate them." The pilot lowered his head, unable to meet his eyes. "I'm sorry, sir," he muttered weakly. James nodded slowly. "I am not the one you should be apologizing to," he pointed to Malik. The pilot hesitated, then knelt slightly in front of the boy. "I am sorry, son. I was wrong." Malik looked at him nervously, then nodded quietly. James put a hand on his shoulder, proud of his calmness. "That's enough, son," he said softly. Then he turned to the airline supervisor who had rushed over after hearing the commotion. "I want a full report on this incident within 24 hours and an immediate review of staff bias and sensitivity training." The supervisor nodded nervously. "Yes, sir, absolutely, sir." James then looked around. Once more the crowd was still watching. He raised his voice, just enough for the cameras to hear. "My son will board this flight now, without further disturbance. Is that understood?" Everyone nodded. Security stepped aside. The gate agent smiled nervously and said, "Yes, sir, we'll take care of him personally." As Malik and his father began walking toward the gate, whispers followed them. People were saying things like, "That's his dad, the FAA administrator. Oh my God, that pilot's career is over." But James didn't care about whispers. He cared about the way his son still looked shaken. He bent down, speaking softly, "Son, you did nothing wrong. You held your head high, and that's what matters. Remember, people might misjudge you, but your worth comes from who you are, not from their fear." Malik nodded, tears rolling down his cheeks. "I just wanted to watch the planes, Dad." James smiled gently. "I know, and one day you'll fly one too." The crowd that had gathered began clapping. Quietly, some passengers called out, "That's right, sir, good job." Standing up for him, James gave a polite nod and guided Malik onto the plane. As they settled into first class, Malik leaned against the window watching the runway, while his father stared out silently. The situation had been humiliating and painful, but it had also sparked something powerful inside him, a need to make sure this never happened again. Little did Captain Ronald know this wasn't the end of the story, because when the FAA administrator files a complaint, things don't just disappear, they echo through the system like thunder, and this storm was only beginning. The next morning, sunlight poured into the tall glass windows of the Federal Aviation Administration headquarters in Washington, D.C. James Turner sat behind his large mahogany desk, his face calm, but his mind sharp. He had spent the entire night thinking about the humiliating incident at the airport, replaying every detail over and over. He opened his laptop and began writing an official report. Subject line: bias and unjust conduct at National Air. Immediate inquiry requested. His fingers moved fast across the keyboard, describing the entire event step by step from the moment Malik was stopped to the moment security grabbed him. He attached multiple video clips passengers had posted online and pressed send. Within minutes, phones began ringing across the aviation network. National Air's legal department scrambled in panic, while executives whispered in emergency meetings. The story had already reached the media. A trending headline read, "Pilot detains Black child without cause, FAA administrator intervenes." James received a dozen calls before noon. Reporters wanted statements. Airline representatives begged for leniency. But James said the same words every time: "The truth will speak for itself." Across the city, Captain Ronald sat in a conference room with his airline's disciplinary board, his face pale, sweat on his forehead. He had been called in for an urgent hearing. The head of operations stared at him sternly. "Captain, do you have any idea who that boy was?" Ronald nodded weakly. "Yes, sir. I do now. The FAA administrator's son." The room fell silent. The director of training folded his arms and said, "Do you understand the gravity of this mistake? You didn't just detain a passenger, you humiliated a child and triggered a national embarrassment for our airline." Ronald tried to defend himself. "It was a misunderstanding. I followed procedure, I thought." The director cut him off sharply. "You thought wrong, and now your thinking has cost us more than you can imagine." Meanwhile, James received a call from the Secretary of Transportation, who had seen the viral clip himself. James, we're reviewing this case. Immediately, bias in aviation is not just a human issue, it's a policy failure. I want your full assessment and recommendations. James responded calmly, you'll have them by end of day, sir. That afternoon, a meeting was held in the airline's executive suite. A dozen high-level officials sat around the long table. Faces tense. The CEO of National Air tapped his pen against the desk, saying, this is beyond bad press. The FAA is directly involved. We're talking about losing billions in contracts and certifications. The public relations head tried to sound optimistic. We can issue an apology and suspend the pilot. Maybe that will calm things down. But the CEO shook his head grimly. No, this man humiliated the son of one of the most respected aviation administrators in the country. A simple apology won't fix it. Back at home, Malik sat quietly on the couch, still shaken. He had seen himself on television clips and social media feeds. People were praising his courage, but it didn't erase the hurt. James noticed his silence and knelt down beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. You okay, son? Malik looked up and whispered, I don't understand, Dad. Why would he think I was dangerous? I was just waiting. James sighed softly. Sometimes people see what they want to see instead of the truth. They don't look at hearts, they look at skin. But you showed strength by staying calm. That's what makes you powerful. Malik nodded, slowly hugging his father. The next day, James walked into an official FAA briefing room. Cameras flashed as he addressed a line of reporters. The incident at National Air raises serious concerns about bias and professionalism in our aviation workforce. Effective immediately an investigation into all staff conduct procedures will begin. We will ensure every traveler, regardless of race, age, or background, is treated with dignity and respect. Applause filled the room. Journalists shouted questions, but James simply said change starts now and walked away. Within a week, the airline faced public outrage. Thousands of people posted online demanding accountability. Hashtags like Justice for Malik and Fly Without Fear trended across the country. Captain Ronald's career crumbled. He was suspended indefinitely, and his name became a warning example in aviation training programs. Nationwide airports began reviewing policies and hosting diversity sessions. But James wasn't done yet. He wanted to ensure real transformation, not just punishment. He proposed a new FAA initiative called Project Equal Sky, a program dedicated to unbiased security practices and cultural awareness in aviation. The Secretary of Transportation personally called him again. James, the president, saw your proposal. We want to fund it. You'll lead. It's starting next quarter. Congratulations. James smiled for the first time in days. Thank you, sir. But this isn't about me. It's about every Malik who deserves to fly safely without being judged. Back in their living room, Malik overheard the conversation. His eyes widened. Dad, does that mean they're changing things because of me? James smiled proudly. That's right, son, you helped change the sky for everyone. Malik's face lit up for the first time since the incident. He hugged his father tightly, whispering, I'm proud of you, Dad. James chuckled softly. No, son, I'm proud of you. But the world hadn't heard the last of them yet, because what happened next would make the nation stop in awe. The very airline that once humiliated them was about to face the most shocking consequence of all, and it would come straight from James Turner himself. 2 weeks later, the glass towers of National Air headquarters gleamed under the morning sun, but inside the walls were filled with panic. The executive board had gathered for an emergency call. The news, spreading across every financial channel, was the same FAA reviewing funding and certification contracts with National Air. The CEO rubbed his forehead, trying to hide the sweat. The moment the FAA cuts us off, we lose half our operations, he said, his voice trembling. One of the board members whispered, it's James Turner, isn't it? He's the one reviewing the contracts. Across town in Washington, D.C., James sat quietly in his office, reading through thick files. Every page represented millions of dollars in infrastructure safety approvals and subsidies granted by his department to airlines across the country. His eyes stopped on one name, National Air. He leaned back in his chair, remembering the moment. Malik's small voice cracked, asking why would he think I was dangerous. That one sentence burned deeper than any insult could. James had dedicated his entire life to fairness, to equality, and to aviation safety, and now that same industry had failed his son. His phone buzzed. It was the Secretary of Transportation, James. The first assume you've seen the financial brief on National Air. We have options. Do we renew their $5 billion funding contract or suspend it? James exhaled, slowly looking out the tall window over the city skyline. Sir, they need to be held accountable. We can't preach equality if we reward discrimination. The secretary paused, then said, do what you think is right. You have full discretion. James hung up the call and stared at the folder on his desk for a long moment, then opened his laptop. He began typing a memo subject federal funding review. National Air. The first line read effective immediately. FAA funding and certification renewal for National Air is suspended pending investigation. The words felt heavy, but necessary. He hit send. The decision traveled instantly through the federal network. Within hours, stock markets reacted. Shares of National Air dropped 15%. In one morning, analysts went live on television, calling it one of the biggest aviation scandals in recent history. Inside the airline headquarters, chaos erupted. Executives shouted across the table, what do you mean suspended? That's billions of dollars. Another answered, the FAA froze our funding. We can't operate without it. The CEO slammed his hand on the table, shouting, this is over one mistake. But another voice spoke quietly from the corner. Maybe it's not one mistake. Maybe it's the culture we created. Maybe we looked the other way too many times. The room fell silent. The truth hung heavy like thunderclouds. Meanwhile, James sat at home with Malik, who was building a small model airplane on the floor. Dad, everyone online says you stop a whole airline, Malik said. Wide-eyed, James smiled faintly. No, son, I didn't stop them. I just made them pause long enough to see what they had become. Malik grinned. So that means people will treat kids like me better now. James nodded. That's the hope, son. But change takes more than one action. It takes a movement. You started that movement by standing tall when they try to make you small. Later that evening, James received a video call from the CEO of National Air. The man's voice was trembling. Sir, please, we understand your decision, but this could destroy thousands of jobs. We've suspended the pilot, terminated staff, retrained teams. We're begging for reconsideration. James looked straight into the camera, calm and steady. The FAA believes in safety, integrity, and equality. You failed all three when you let bias lead your judgment. He paused for a moment, then continued, I don't destroy companies, I rebuild systems. Prove to me you can rebuild yours. The CEO nodded desperately. We will, sir. We'll do anything you ask. James leaned closer, then start by issuing a public apology, not just to me or my son, but to every child who has been judged before being understood. Show me actions, not headlines. The next morning, National Air held a live press conference. The CEO stood at the podium, flanked by his senior staff. Cameras flashed as he spoke on behalf of National Air. We sincerely apologize to Malik Turner and his family. We failed to uphold the values of respect and equality. This incident will redefine how we train and treat every passenger from this day forward. James watched the broadcast from his office. Malik sat beside him, smiling a little. That's me, Dad. They said my name on TV. James chuckled softly. That's right, son. And maybe one day they'll remember your name for something even greater. Later that night, James wrote a follow-up letter to the Secretary of Transportation recommending partial reinstatement of funding with strict diversity and accountability conditions. The Secretary approved it immediately. Across the country, people began to share the story of the little boy and his father who changed the sky. Airlines started hosting equality sessions. Schools discussed the case in ethics classes, and parents told their kids about Malik, the boy who stood tall, even when the world looked down on him. But for James, the real victory wasn't money or headlines. It was the quiet moment when Malik smiled again, when the fear in his eyes was replaced with pride that was worth more than any contract or career. Still, one chapter remained. The world had seen justice. Now it was time for forgiveness. The lesson that truly completes every story. A few months later, the world had moved on from headlines and scandals, but inside James Turner's heart, a quiet question still lingered. Could he forgive the man who had humiliated his son, the pilot, who once stood proud, now sat forgotten, his career uncertain, his future blurred? James was preparing to speak at a national aviation conference when his assistant entered the room. Sir, Captain Ronald is here. He requested a private meeting before your speech. James looked up surprised. Tell him to wait. For a moment, James hesitated. His instincts as a father told him to refuse, but his spirit as a leader whispered something else. Sometimes the greatest power is not in punishment, but in forgiveness. He took a deep breath and said, "Send him in." The door opened slowly. Ronald stepped inside, wearing a plain suit instead of a pilot's uniform. His posture was humble, his voice quiet. "Thank you for seeing me, sir." James gestured to a seat, but said nothing, letting the silence fill the space. Ronald's eyes were tired. He spoke softly. "I lost my position, my license, my respect. My family can barely look at me anymore. I know I deserve it. But I couldn't move on without saying this to you face to face. I'm sorry, sir, not just to you, but to your son. I was wrong, deeply wrong. I judged without thought. I acted without heart." James listened without interrupting. The words carried genuine pain, not excuses. Finally, he said, "Why now?" Ronald looked down. "Because I saw the video again, the one where your boy stood there and didn't cry, didn't fight. He just asked why, and that question haunted me." James leaned back in his chair, remembering that exact moment. Malik's trembling voice. "Why would he think I was dangerous?" It echoed again through his mind. He sighed and said, "Captain, people make mistakes, but leadership is measured by what they do afterward. You cannot undo what happened, but you can ensure no one repeats it." Ronald nodded firmly. "I already started volunteering, sir, at a youth aviation program teaching kids about planes. And respect, many of them are like your son. I tell them about him every time." James's stern expression softened slightly. "That's a good start," he said. Then Ronald said one more thing that silenced the room. "I'd like to meet Malik, if you'll allow it, not to fix anything, just to apologize man to man." James thought for a moment, then smiled faintly. "I think that's a good idea. He'll be here after school. You can tell him yourself." 86,586. That evening, Malik entered the conference room, wearing his little jacket, the same one he had worn that day at the airport. He froze for a second when he saw the pilot. "Dad, that's him." James nodded. "It's okay, son, listen first." Ronald stood up and knelt to Malik's level, speaking softly. "Son, I'm sorry for what I did. I hurt you and your family, and I'll never forgive myself for it. You didn't deserve that. I judged you when all you did was wait for your mother. I hope one day you can forgive me." Malik looked at his father. James smiled encouragingly. The boy hesitated, then took a deep breath and said quietly, "I forgive you, sir. Everyone deserves a second chance." Tears welled up in Ronald's eyes. He nodded. "Thank you. That means more than you know." James placed a hand on his son's shoulder, proud of the strength that came from compassion rather than anger. Later on stage at the conference, James stood before hundreds of aviation professionals. He began his speech without slides, without notes, just heart. He said, "A few months ago, my son was pulled aside at an airport for no reason other than a false assumption. That day, I realized something. No matter how advanced our technology becomes, the heart of aviation, the soul of leadership, will always be humanity. We fly machines, but it's people who make them soar." The audience rose in applause. Some wiped tears. Others stood silently, reflecting. The story of Malik and James had become more than a scandal. It had become a symbol of change. When the speech ended, Malik joined his father on stage. The crowd erupted in cheers. Cameras flashed again, but this time it wasn't about humiliation or outrage. It was about hope and progress. James looked down at his son and whispered quietly, "The sky is yours now." Malik smiled and said, "Then I'll make it better for everyone, Dad." As they walked off stage hand in hand, a reporter called out, "Sir, what's next for you and your family?" James turned slightly and replied, "The next chapter is about building bridges, not burning them." The world would remember the name James Turner not just as an FAA administrator, but as a father who turned pain into progress, and a boy named Malik who turned fear into forgiveness. And somewhere high above the clouds, a pilot who had once fallen from grace smiled quietly, knowing that forgiveness had given him the wings to start again. If this story touched your heart, give it a like. Share it with someone who needs hope. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories about courage, kindness, and justice. Because one story can change the sky.